In the quiet heart of an ancient forest, there lived a golden deer unlike any other. Its coat shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, and in its gentle eyes, one could see the reflection of endless compassion. The elders whispered that this deer could hear the cries of every living being, from the smallest insect to the mightiest bird, and within its heart flowed an endless stream of kindness. Yet, such purity often draws both wonder and danger. Hunters roamed the forest, greedy eyes searching for its radiant form, while the deer moved with grace, carrying wisdom older than time itself. This is not just the tale of an animal. It is a story of courage, compassion, and the mysterious law of cause and effect that governs all life. As you listen, let each word wash over you like the rustle of leaves in the evening wind. Allow the story to cradle your mind in calmness, guiding you deeper into peace and stillness. Stay with this journey until the end, for within the tale of the golden deer lies a timeless truth that may ease your heart and lull you into the soft embrace of sleep. If these stories bring comfort to your nights, I invite you to subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep, where each story is a gentle lantern, lighting the way to both rest and reflection. Under the canopy of an ancient forest where time seemed to stand still, the world unfolded in shades of green and gold. The air was filled with the fragrance of damp earth, the sweetness of wild blossoms, and the gentle sound of 1,000 unseen lives whispering in harmony. The forest had existed long before men began to shape stories, long before kingdoms rose and fell, and within its endless depths lived a creature so radiant and gentle that even the stars paused to gaze down upon it. The golden deer, as it was known, was unlike any other being in the woods. Its coat shimmered as if sunlight itself had chosen to rest upon its back, and its eyes, deep and serene, reflected a compassion that seemed boundless. Every movement of the golden deer was fluid and silent, like a melody carried on the evening breeze. The forest itself seemed to respond to its presence. Birds sang softer when it passed, as though in reverence, and streams glittered more brightly, as if eager to offer it a path. Unlike the other creatures who lived with instinctual caution, the golden deer moved without fear, for within its heart lived a profound trust in the interconnectedness of all beings. The elders among the animals often spoke in hushed tones about the deer. They said that its spirit was ancient, that it carried within it the echoes of countless lifetimes, and that in its silence it held wisdom deeper than the roots of the oldest trees. It was said the golden deer could feel the pain of a broken wing, the hunger of a young cub, the sorrow of a mother bird whose chicks had fallen from the nest. Whenever suffering touched the forest, the deer was drawn to it, not out of curiosity but out of a deep and unshakable kindness. This forest was not untouched by danger, for just as beauty thrives, so too does peril. Predators prowled the shadows, and beyond the borders of the forest lived men whose desires knew no limit. To them, the golden deer was more than a creature. It was a prize, a symbol of wealth and status, something to be captured and claimed. Yet the deer, unaware of the greed that brewed in distant villages and palaces, lived with the purity of one who sees all life as equal. It drank gently from streams, careful not to muddy the water for those who would drink after. It grazed on tender shoots, but left enough for others to share. And when danger approached, it did not meet it with anger or force, but with an almost divine calm that disarmed even the fiercest of threats. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon with streaks of crimson and violet, the golden deer stood in a meadow, the tall grasses brushing against its side. The forest seemed to hold its breath. A family of rabbits huddled nearby, watching with wide eyes as the deer lowered its head to graze. Overhead, a pair of owls circled slowly, their wings whispering through the air. It was in moments like this that the forest felt like a temple, with the golden deer as its silent guardian. The deer's life was not lived in solitude, for though it was revered, it was also deeply connected. A young fawn once lost its mother to a lurking predator, and the golden deer took it under its watchful care, guiding it to safe grazing grounds, showing it where the sweetest water flowed, and resting beside it in the stillness of night. A bird with a broken wing had once fallen from its nest, and the deer, careful and tender, carried it upon its back until it could heal. Even the smallest ant benefited from the deer's kindness, for it would step with gentle precision, never crushing the trails that wound like threads through the forest floor. Yet despite the harmony it cultivated, a sense of unease slowly crept into the forest. Whispers drifted on the wind, carried from distant villages. Hunters had heard tales of a deer whose coat shone like sunlight, a creature worth more than gold, a trophy that would bring renown. They sharpened their arrows, polished their spears, and made plans to enter the woods. The animals sensed this long before the men arrived. Birds flew more restlessly, their calls sharper than before. The wolves prowled with greater urgency, uneasy at the tension that stirred beneath the trees. And yet, the golden deer remained calm, its eyes reflecting the still waters of an inner lake untouched by fear. To it, life was not measured by the length of days or the safety of each moment, but by the depth of compassion shown and the peace carried within. On nights when the moon shone full and bright, casting its silver glow upon the forest, the deer would wander to the edges of a glade and gaze upward, as if communing with the heavens. Its breath rose like mist, slow and steady, blending with the night air. The forests seemed to gather around it, as though every tree and creature leaned closer to share in the quiet blessing. Stories spread among the animals of dreams carried by the golden deer. Some said that when they slept in its presence, their dreams were filled with visions of rivers that never ran dry, of fields that bore endless harvests, of skies free from storms. Others said they felt a deep comfort, as though the very essence of life had whispered to them in their sleep. Still, beyond the forest, men grew restless. A prince from a faraway land had heard the tale and vowed that he would not rest until the golden deer was his. He sent scouts to the forest, men who crept like shadows through the undergrowth, seeking signs of the shimmering coat. The forest resisted them, its paths twisting into confusion, its silence growing heavier, yet determination is often stronger than warning. As the men drew closer, the animals grew anxious. The rabbits darted nervously through their burrows. The foxes barked sharp warnings in the night, and the birds flew high into the skies, their cries echoing like alarms. The golden deer, however, continued its gentle way, guiding lost fawns, sharing its peace with the weary, drinking from clear streams as though nothing threatened its world. To those who looked upon it, the deer seemed untouched by the shadows gathering around. It was in this balance between beauty and danger, compassion and greed, that the story of the golden deer truly began to unfold. For though its heart was boundless and its spirit unwavering, the world beyond the forest was closing in, step by deliberate step, and soon the gentle creature would be tested in ways even it could not foresee. Yet, on that evening, as fireflies drifted lazily through the air and the scent of jasmine rose from the earth, the forest was still. The golden deer lifted its head, ears twitching to the rhythm of the wind, and for a moment all was peace. The great trees bowed in silence, The stars shimmered in approval, and time itself seemed to pause, holding the fragile beauty of the golden deer in its gentle hands. The days that followed in the ancient forest unfolded with a delicate rhythm, as though the earth itself beat with a hidden heart that only the golden deer could hear. Sunlight spilled through the canopy in soft patterns, dappling the ground where wildflowers opened their petals to the morning. The streams flowed with their unbroken song, carrying reflections of the sky and the forest alike, and every creature moved in harmony with the world that had sheltered them since time immemorial. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, a new current began to stir, a quiet unease that spread like ripples across still water. The animals could feel it, though no man had yet entered the deeper heart of the woods. The songbirds who once sang freely now paused between notes, listening to a silence that seemed too heavy. The foxes, ever wary, trotted restlessly along hidden paths. Even the trees, ancient and wise, creaked as if whispering warnings to one another. The golden deer, however, carried itself with the same grace as always, wandering through meadows where tall grasses swayed, pausing to drink from pools so clear that stars seemed to float upon them. In its eyes, there was no trace of fear, only an endless reflection of peace, as if it carried within itself a sanctuary that no outside force could disturb. Still, stories from beyond the forest grew louder, carried by traders, hunters, and wandering pilgrims who spoke of a deer whose coat shimmered like gold under the sun. Some called it a miracle of the gods, others a prize fit for kings, and still others a creature destined to be captured, its life given to fulfill ambition and greed. These stories traveled to the ears of a prince, young yet filled with restless desire. He was a man who had grown weary of simple triumphs, whose eyes looked beyond his own land for wonders he might claim. When word of the golden deer reached him, he felt as though fate itself had whispered his name. He vowed to find the deer, to bring it back as proof of his greatness, and to ensure that his name would be remembered beyond his years. He gathered his men, skilled hunters and loyal soldiers, and instructed them to prepare for a journey into the forest. The men sharpened their spears, bound their arrows, and tested the strength of their bows. Some among them hesitated, for they had heard tales that the forest was not like other lands. They spoke of strange mists that confused even the most skilled tracker, of shadows that shifted as though alive, of voices carried on the wind that belonged to no man or beast. But their doubts were silenced by loyalty to their prince and the promise of reward should they succeed. Meanwhile, within the forest, life continued to weave its quiet patterns. The golden deer tended to the needs of the creatures around it, guiding a lost boar back to its herd, standing watch as fledglings learned to take their first trembling flight, and moving with patient care through the undergrowth so as not to disturb the smallest of lives. To all who lived there, the golden deer was not simply another animal. It was a presence, a reminder that compassion could exist even in a world filled with hunger and survival. One evening, as the forest was bathed in the fading hues of twilight, the deer sensed a shift in the air. It was subtle, like a single note out of place in a familiar song, but it carried with it a weight that could not be ignored. The wind was sharper, the stillness deeper, and in that silence came the faint trace of human scent. The deer did not run, nor did it hide. Instead, it stood still beneath a great banyan tree, eyes half closed, as though listening to something only it could hear. Perhaps it was the warning of the earth, or the murmurs of the spirits that lingered among the roots. But in that moment the deer understood that its path was about to change. As the first band of hunters entered the outer edges of the forest, the animals grew restless. The birds scattered into the air with urgent cries, their wings cutting sharp lines against the sky. Deer of other herds stamped nervously, ears flicking at the sound of breaking branches. The wolves, sensing intrusion, lifted their heads to the wind and growled low and deep. Yet the forest itself remained still, ancient and watchful, as though it had seen countless men enter before and knew the stories that would follow. The prince rode at the front of his men, his eyes searching eagerly for signs of the golden coat he had heard so much about. His heart burned with ambition, with the thought of standing before his people bearing a creature of legend. But the deeper he rode into the forest, the more it seemed to resist him. Paths wound back upon themselves, rivers shifted their course, and the thick mist that rose at dusk clung to them, turning even the bravest men uneasy. Nights in the forest were unlike nights elsewhere. The darkness was alive, filled with the soft footfalls of unseen creatures, the rustle of leaves stirred by movements too delicate to name, and the calls of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some of the men muttered prayers, others tightened their grip on their weapons, but the prince urged them forward, unwilling to be deterred by shadows and whispers. Days passed, and though they saw many deer, none shone with the golden light they sought. Frustration grew among the men, and hunger gnawed at their patience. Yet the prince would not relent. He believed the deer was real, that it was close, and that it was meant for him alone. Deep within the forest, the golden deer wandered, aware of the presence of strangers, yet unchanged in its ways. It drank, it grazed, it moved with the same serenity, as though the world of men was no more threatening than a passing cloud. Some said the deer was blessed by the gods. Others whispered that it was itself a spirit sent to remind the living of truths long forgotten. Whatever it was, its path and the path of the prince were destined to cross. One dawn, when the mist lay heavy upon the earth and the forest was cloaked in silence, the prince came upon a meadow. The first rays of sun pierced the veil of fog, and there, at the far edge, stood the golden deer. It was grazing quietly, the light of the morning sun clinging to its coat until it seemed to glow from within. For a moment the prince was struck not by triumph but by awe. He felt his breath catch, his heart pause, as though he had seen something not meant for mortal eyes. His men raised their bows, but he lifted his hand to stop them. The deer lifted its head, ears twitching at the sound, and their eyes met across the meadow. In those eyes the prince saw no fear, no anger, only a depth of calm that unsettled him more than any battle he had fought. It was as though the deer looked not at his body, but at his soul, weighing it silently, holding up a mirror he had never dared to face. The moment stretched, fragile as the morning light, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a movement as graceful as falling petals, the golden deer turned and slipped into the trees, vanishing as though it had never been. The prince spurred his horse forward, his men close behind, the chase now ignited. But the forest, alive and endless, swallowed them in its labyrinth. And though they pursued with all their strength, the golden deer remained always just out of reach, shimmering like a dream that fades with the dawn. The forest stretched on endlessly, a living labyrinth where shadows twisted and sunlight filtered down in shifting patterns that played tricks upon the eyes. The prince and his men pressed deeper into its heart, driven by the memory of the golden deer that had appeared before them in the meadow, its coat glowing like a vision of the heavens, only to vanish into the trees as though swallowed by the earth itself. Each step they took was fueled by desire, by the restless hunger of a man who believed the world owed him a prize. And though the forest seemed to resist, he urged his men forward with promises of glory and reward. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, but the golden deer never returned to their sight. They found traces, faint impressions in the soil, tufts of golden hair clinging to low branches, but each time they thought they were close, the trail would vanish. The forest was alive in ways they could not comprehend, paths looping back upon themselves, streams that shifted their course, birds whose sudden cries would send the hunters off in the wrong direction. The prince grew impatient, yet beneath his frustration was a gnawing awe. For he had looked into the eyes of the golden deer and had seen something he could not name. Those eyes lingered in his mind, unshakable, carrying not the wild fear of prey but the calm of one who has seen beyond suffering. His men, however, thought only of capture. They muttered of the wealth its hide would bring, of the fame that would follow them if they returned with the radiant creature bound in chains. Their greed was raw, untempered by any sense of reverence, and it poisoned their resolve until the forest itself seemed to shudder beneath their footsteps. Yet the golden deer was not blind to their pursuit. It moved with purpose, aware of the eyes that sought it, but never straying from its nature. Where other deer would flee in panic, it walked softly, its steps measured, pausing to drink from hidden pools, to graze in secret glades, to comfort the creatures who lived in fear of the disturbance. To a sparrow that had lost its nest in a storm, it offered silent companionship beneath the safety of its shadow. To a wolf cub separated from its pack, it stood patiently until the mother returned, never once betraying fear of fangs or claws. The golden deer lived in harmony, even as hunters closed in, and in its stillness it seemed to hold a strength greater than any spear. As the pursuit dragged on, the prince's men grew restless. Some whispered of turning back, of abandoning the quest before the forest consumed them. Strange things had begun to happen in the nights. Campfires would sputter without cause, shadows flickered where no man stood, and dreams came heavy with visions of eyes watching them, eyes that gleamed with golden light. They woke unsettled, clutching their weapons, only to find the forest silent and unmoved. Still, the prince would not retreat. He spoke of destiny, of how the deer was meant for him, how its capture would mark the height of his reign. His voice burned with ambition, but beneath the fire was a flicker of doubt, a whisper he refused to acknowledge. He had seen peace in the deer's gaze, and it unsettled him more than failure itself. One morning, as mist curled low along the forest floor, the hunters came upon a clearing. There, at its center, the golden deer stood once more, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Its coat glowed as though the sun itself had descended, and the air around it seemed hushed, reverent. The men gasped, their greed rekindled, and they raised their bows. But again the prince hesitated, his hand rising to halt them, his heart torn between desire and something softer, something he could not name. The deer did not flee. It stood still, watching them, its eyes calm, its breath steady. The forest seemed to bend around it, the trees leaning, the light pooling, as though all creation acknowledged its presence. The prince felt the weight of that moment, the gravity of a choice pressing upon him. But his men, driven by impatience, loosed an arrow before he could speak. The shaft flew through the air, its point glinting, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath. Yet the arrow never found its mark. A gust of wind, sudden and fierce, bent its course, sending it into the earth at the deer's feet. The golden deer did not flinch. It only lowered its head, as though in sorrow rather than fear, and then turned once more, vanishing into the depths of the trees. The men shouted in frustration, but the prince said nothing. He stood staring at the place where the deer had stood, his mind reeling. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not because of defeat, but because he had glimpsed something greater than conquest, something beyond the reach of greed. His men grumbled, accusing the forest of trickery, but he could not tear his thoughts away from the deer's gaze. That night, as they camped beneath the stars, the prince lay awake, his mind restless. He dreamed not of glory, but of golden eyes filled with compassion, eyes that saw through him as though stripping away every mask he had ever worn. He woke, in a sweat, his chest tight, the sound of the forest heavy around him. Still, when dawn came, he pressed onward, his pride refusing to yield, though his heart had already begun to shift. The golden deer, meanwhile, wandered deeper into the heart of the forest where few had ever tread. It moved with the grace of water, its presence a balm to all who encountered it. Creatures who had never known peace felt a moment of ease in its company. Even the great trees seemed to bow slightly when it passed, their leaves whispering blessings upon its path. It knew the hunters followed, but it did not curse them, nor did it quicken its pace in fear. To the deer, life was not something to cling to or to lose, but something to be lived fully in each moment, with compassion at its core. And so the chase continued, a dance between greed and grace, between the hunger of men and the serenity of a creature who carried within it a wisdom older than kingdoms. The prince's heart grew heavier with each passing day, torn between ambition and the truth reflected in the deer's eyes. His men grew more desperate, their hunger sharpening into anger, but the forest resisted them, twisting their paths, cloaking the deer in its shadows, allowing it to appear and vanish like a dream. It was in this tension, this fragile balance, that the story deepened. For though the men pursued with all their strength, it was not the deer that was being hunted, but their own hearts, tested and revealed by the presence of something pure. The forest had grown deeper and denser as the days passed, its towering trees forming a living cathedral, where sunlight entered only in fractured beams and silence hung heavy in the air. The prince and his men had lost all sense of time as they continued their pursuit of the golden deer, their bodies weary from the endless march, their tempers sharpened by failure, and yet their determination unbroken. They were driven by more than hunger now, driven by the memory of the shimmering coat that had vanished before their eyes, driven by the unsettling calm that lingered in the deer's gaze. The forest seemed to conspire against them, leading them in circles, confusing their tracks, and cloaking the deer in mystery, yet the prince refused to yield. Each night they camped beneath the canopy. The men whispered of strange happenings, of voices on the wind that called their names, of dreams that left them restless and fearful. They spoke of golden light drifting through the trees, guiding them and mocking them in equal measure. And some swore they saw the deer watching from the shadows, only to vanish when they drew closer. Fear gnawed at them, but greed was stronger, and the promise of rewards silenced their doubts. The prince, however, lay awake each night, torn between ambition and an unease he could not explain. He thought of the eyes of the golden deer, eyes that seemed to pierce deeper than flesh and bone, eyes that looked upon him not with hatred or fear, but with a compassion that unsettled his very soul. He could not escape the memory, nor could he admit its hold upon him, for he was a prince and a hunter, and his life had been built upon conquest. Yet deep within, something began to shift. A crack in the foundation of his certainty, a whisper that questioned the path he had chosen. The golden deer moved as it always had, graceful and unhurried, its steps soft upon the earth, its presence bringing peace to those it encountered. It wandered through hidden glades where streams sparkled like crystal, through meadows where wildflowers bowed beneath the wind, through groves where the air was thick with the scent of blossoms. To every creature, it was a guardian, a silent protector whose kindness knew no bounds. It did not fear the hunters, nor did it hate them, for within its heart lay only compassion. It knew their desire, it knew their blindness, and yet it pitied them, for they were bound by chains they could not see. Chains of greed and ambition that weighed heavier than any iron. One evening, as twilight deepened and shadows stretched long across the forest floor, the golden deer came upon a fox whose leg had been caught in a hunter's snare left by men who had passed through long before. The fox whimpered in pain, its body trembling as it tried in vain to free itself. The deer approached slowly, its eyes calm, its presence gentle. With careful steps, it lowered its head and pressed against the snare, loosening the cruel knot until the fox was free. The fox, though in pain, gazed up at the deer with gratitude, its eyes reflecting the light of something greater than survival. The forest watched silently, the trees standing tall as witnesses to the act, the wind carrying whispers of reverence through the leaves. The hunters, however, pressed on, their eyes fixed only upon their goal. Their supplies dwindled, their tempers frayed, yet the thought of abandoning the quest was unthinkable. The prince urged them forward, though his heart grew heavier with doubt. He spoke of destiny, of triumph, of the glory that awaited them, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. He remembered the moment when the arrow had been turned aside by the wind, remembered the sorrow in the deer's eyes, and he wondered whether fate itself stood against him. The men grew impatient and reckless, setting traps, leaving bait, searching the forest with desperate energy. Yet the deer remained untouched, slipping through their snares as though the forest itself guided its steps. They cursed the trees, cursed the earth, cursed even the prince when their efforts failed, but he silenced them with the force of his will. Still, the doubt lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. For the prince had begun to sense that their pursuit was not one of conquest, but of revelation. That the deer was not prey, but a mirror reflecting their own hearts. One morning, as the mist rose from the earth like breath and the air shimmered with dew, the prince stood alone beside a stream. The water was clear, reflecting the sky above, and as he gazed into it, he saw not only his own face, but the memory of golden eyes staring back at him. His chest tightened, and he turned away, unwilling to face the truth the vision offered. He was a hunter, a prince, a man of strength and ambition, and yet within him stirred a seed of humility, fragile and persistent, planted by the gaze of the golden deer. The chase wore on, dragging them deeper into the forest than they had ever gone. The men grew thin, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet still they followed, for greed is a flame that consumes even as it destroys. The prince, though weary, pressed onward, his heart torn in two, caught between desire and awakening. And always the deer remained just beyond reach, appearing and vanishing, a beacon of light that guided and eluded in equal measure. One night, as the stars shone faintly through the canopy and the forest lay in silence, the prince dreamed of standing in an endless field. The golden deer approached him, its steps soundless, its eyes filled with light. It spoke without words, its voice a melody that resonated within his chest, telling him of compassion, of the chains of desire, of the truth that lay beyond greed. He awoke with tears upon his face, though he did not understand why. He sat in silence until dawn, staring into the embers of the dying fire, while his men muttered in their sleep. By the time the sun rose, he knew that the chase was no longer what it had been. It was no longer about triumph or glory. It was a journey into himself, into the depths of his own soul, guided by a creature whose purity revealed his own shadows. And yet, bound by pride and expectation, he could not turn back, not yet. The forest held its breath, the animals watched in silence, and the golden deer moved forward, ever graceful, ever compassionate, knowing that the story was not nearing its end but only deepening. For the lessons yet to come would test not only the prince and his men, but the very essence of their humanity. The days turned into weeks, and the pursuit of the golden deer became more than a hunt. It became an obsession that consumed the prince and his men. The forest had changed them in ways they did not yet understand, stripping them of the comfort of their routines, testing their endurance, and confronting them with silences deeper than they had ever known. The men who had once laughed by campfires and boasted of their strength now moved in brooding silence, their faces gaunt and their eyes shadowed by exhaustion. The prince, though still regal in bearing, carried within him a weight he could not shake, a heaviness born not of the long march or the endless chase, but of the gaze of the golden deer that haunted his every thought. The forest seemed alive in ways that defied reason. Paths twisted upon themselves so that a day's journey brought the hunters back to where they had begun. Rivers shifted course, forcing them to wade through cold waters that sapped their strength. Strange lights flickered in the night, neither fire nor star, drifting through the trees as though guided by unseen hands. Whispers floated on the wind, voices that called their names or laughed softly in the dark, unsettling even the bravest among them. Some of the men muttered that the deer was no ordinary creature, that it was a spirit or a guardian sent to protect the forest, and that their pursuit was doomed to end in ruin. But the prince silenced such words, his pride unwilling to accept defeat. Still, in the depths of his heart, doubt grew stronger. He remembered the eyes of the golden deer, the calm that had looked through him and seen what he could not admit. And he wondered whether they were truly chasing a beast or a truth far greater than they were prepared to face. The deer itself continued to move with its unbroken grace. It wandered through meadows bathed in moonlight, across ridges where the wind sang like a chorus, and through valleys where streams wound like silver threads. Its presence was a blessing upon all it encountered. Birds sang more sweetly in its company, flowers seemed to open wider, and even predators lowered their gaze as it passed. It carried no fear, no malice, only compassion, as though its very existence was a prayer whispered to the world. One day, as the hunters pressed deeper into the forest, they came upon a clearing where the deer stood once more, radiant beneath the morning sun. Its coat gleamed as if woven of pure light, and its eyes reflected a depth that seemed endless. The men raised their weapons eagerly, but again the prince held up his hand, his voice sharp as he ordered them to wait. He could not bring himself to strike, for in the presence of the deer he felt as though he stood before a temple, as though to harm it would be to shatter something sacred. His men grumbled, their greed demanding action, but they obeyed. The deer stood motionless, watching them with eyes that held no fear, only sorrow, and then turned and walked calmly into the forest once more. The men groaned in frustration, but the prince remained silent, his heart torn between ambition and awakening. That night, as they camped beneath the stars, the prince sat apart from his men, staring into the flames. His thoughts were a storm, his pride clashing against the quiet truth that had begun to unfold within him. He dreamed again of the deer, its voice like a river flowing through his soul, telling him of compassion, of the futility of desire, of the peace that lay beyond conquest. He woke with tears upon his face, though he did not understand why, and he sat in silence as the fire burned low, listening to the whispers of the forest. His men, however, grew restless. Their greed consumed them, their patience wore thin, and they began to murmur against the prince. They wanted to act, to strike, to seize the deer by any means necessary. They plotted among themselves, their voices hushed but sharp with hunger, and their eyes gleamed with the madness of obsession. The prince sensed their growing defiance, but he said nothing, for he was torn between his role as leader and the truth that pressed against his heart. Days passed, and the men grew bolder in their defiance. They set traps in secret, laid snares along the paths, and waited with poisoned arrows hidden beneath their cloaks. Yet the forest resisted them, twisting their plans, breaking their traps, and turning their arrows aside. The deer remained untouched, always just beyond their grasp, as though the world itself bent to protect it. Frustration grew into anger, and anger into rage. The men cursed the prince for his hesitation, cursed the forest for its trickery, and cursed the deer for its elusiveness. They became reckless, trampling through sacred groves, cutting down young trees for their fires, and driving animals from their homes in their fury. The balance of the forest trembled, disturbed by their greed, and the air grew heavy with sorrow. The golden deer, watching from the shadows, did not hate them, but its eyes grew heavier with sadness. It saw not enemies, but beings lost in their own darkness, bound by chains of desire they could not see. It pitied them, for they knew not the suffering they sowed, nor the suffering that awaited them in return. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with crimson and gold, the prince confronted his men. He spoke of patience, of destiny, of the need to wait and trust in fate, but they no longer listened. Their hearts were hardened, their ears closed, and their eyes saw only the gleam of treasure in the deer's radiant coat. They whispered among themselves of taking matters into their own hands, of seizing the deer without the prince's consent, and in their whispers the seed of betrayal began to grow. That night, while the prince slept, a group of his men rose in secret and slipped away into the forest. They carried their bows, their snares, and their poisoned arrows, determined to capture the deer for themselves. They moved swiftly, their greed burning brighter than their fear, and soon they came upon the deer grazing in a moonlit glade. Its coat shimmered like liquid light, and its eyes lifted to meet theirs, calm and unafraid. For a moment they hesitated, struck by its presence, but their greed was stronger. They raised their bows and loosed their arrows. Yet once again the forest intervened. A sudden wind swept through the glade, bending the branches and scattering the arrows harmlessly into the earth. The men cursed and fired again, but each arrow missed, striking only shadows. The deer stood still, watching them, its eyes filled with sorrow, and then turned and vanished into the trees, leaving them trembling with rage. They returned to the camp in shame, their hearts filled with bitterness. And when the prince awoke and saw their faces, he knew what they had done. He said nothing, but in his silence was a weight heavier than any words. The forest grew darker in the days that followed, the air thick with unease. The men argued among themselves, their unity shattered, their trust broken. Some wanted to turn back, to leave the forest before it destroyed them, while others demanded that they press on until the deer was theirs. The prince stood between them, torn by doubt, haunted by the gaze of the deer, and unable to lead them as he once had. The chase had become more than a hunt. It had become a mirror that revealed the truth of each man's heart. And what it revealed was not glory, but shadows. Yet still they pressed on, deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees grew taller, the light dimmer, and the air heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The golden deer moved before them, ever graceful, ever compassionate, guiding them not toward conquest, but toward the truth they sought to avoid. And though they did not yet understand, the greatest trial was still to come. A trial that would test not the strength of their arms, but the strength of their hearts. And in that trial, the path of the prince and the path of the deer would converge in ways that neither could escape. The forest had grown almost unbearable in its silence as the men pressed deeper, their bodies frail with hunger and their spirits fractured by doubt. Yet the promise of the golden deer still burned in their eyes like fire that refused to die. The prince, though still firm in command, felt the weight of his choices pressing heavier with each step. For the forest seemed no longer simply a place of trees and shadows, but a living being that breathed and watched and judged. His dreams had become relentless, filled with the golden deer standing before him in endless fields of light. Its eyes filled not with fear, but with a compassion so deep that it pierced him more sharply than any weapon could. Each morning he awoke, drenched in sweat, his heart heavy with questions he could not bring himself to voice, and yet his pride and the eyes of his men drove him onward. The golden deer wandered still, untouched by fear, its steps soundless upon the moss and soil, its presence a balm to the creatures of the forest who suffered under the disturbance of the hunters. It lingered by a nest of orphaned birds, guarding them until they found the strength to fly, and stood beside an injured stag until the wound in its leg no longer bled. To the animals it was not prey but guardian, and the forest itself seemed to bend around it, guiding its steps away from snares, scattering winds to break the flight of arrows, cloaking it in mists that disoriented the hunters. Yet the hunters grew restless, and whispers of mutiny thickened in the air. Many nights the men argued by the fires, their voices sharp, their eyes gleaming with desperation. Some demanded to leave, fearing the forest's wrath, while others demanded to press on, consumed by greed for the coat of light they had glimpsed. They no longer looked to the prince as they once had, for they sensed his heart faltering, his hesitation betraying them. Their trust cracked, and from those cracks grew the seed of betrayal. The prince knew this, yet he said little. He could not explain to them the weight he carried, the visions that haunted him, the unshakable truth that grew clearer with each passing day, that the deer was no ordinary creature, that their pursuit was not one of conquest, but of revelation. Still, pride chained him, the need to appear strong in the eyes of his men, binding him to a path he no longer believed in. One day, as the sun was swallowed by thick clouds and the air grew heavy with the scent of rain, the hunters stumbled into a vast clearing unlike any they had seen before. At its center stood the golden deer, its body radiant against the gray sky, its eyes steady and sorrowful. The men gasped, their greed surging, and they raised their bows with trembling hands. The prince raised his voice to halt them, but his words were drowned by the sudden roll of thunder that cracked through the sky. The deer did not move. It stood calm, its breath steady, as though it had chosen this moment. The men loosed their arrows, and once again the forest rose to shield its guardian. Winds howled, bending the shafts away, trees groaned and shifted, scattering branches across their path, and the rain poured in sheets so heavy that no eye could follow the flight of a single arrow. The hunters cursed and shouted, their rage echoing through the clearing, but the deer did not flee. It lowered its head as though in mourning, then turned and walked slowly into the storm, vanishing as though it had become part of the rain itself. The prince sank to his knees, his chest heavy with something he could not name, his heart breaking beneath the weight of what he had witnessed. His men, however, grew furious. They blamed the forest, they blamed fate, they blamed the prince himself for his hesitation, for his unwillingness to command them to strike more swiftly, more cruelly. That night the camp was filled not with silence but with mutiny. Voices rose in anger, accusations flew, and blades were drawn. The prince stood firm, his voice cutting through the storm of their rage, but he knew that his men were slipping beyond his command, that their hunger had driven them into madness. They no longer saw the deer as a creature of beauty or a spirit of compassion. They saw only treasure denied to them, and in their eyes burned a violence that threatened to consume everything. In the heart of the forest, the golden deer lingered, its steps slow, its eyes heavy with sorrow. It knew the hunters would not stop, that their greed had bound them too tightly, and yet it did not hate them. It pitied them, for they were lost within themselves, blind to the truth that lay before them. Still, it moved forward, knowing that the time of great trial was drawing near. A trial not of its own choosing, but of the path woven by the hands of fate. The prince awoke the next morning to find that half his men had deserted in the night, taking what food and weapons they could carry, their voices bitter with curses as they vanished into the trees. Those who remained were hardened, their greed sharper, their loyalty twisted into resentment. They followed only because they still believed the deer could be caught, and their eyes burned with the need to claim it. The prince felt the fracture in his company like a wound, but he did not turn back. He pressed on, his heart heavy, his spirit torn, knowing that the path ahead would demand a price none of them were prepared to pay. For days they pursued shadows, catching fleeting glimpses of golden light between the trees, hearing the faintest whisper of hooves upon the earth, but never drawing near enough to strike. The forest grew darker, its silence oppressive, its paths tangled and uncertain. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, exhaustion bent their backs, yet still they pressed forward, bound by desire, bound by pride. Then came the night of the great storm. The sky split open with lightning, the winds howled like 1,000 voices, and the rain fell in torrents that drowned the earth. The hunters huddled beneath trees, their fires extinguished, their spirits broken, while the prince stood alone beneath the storm, his arms raised as though in surrender to the heavens. He cried out, though whether to the gods, to the deer, or to himself, he did not know. His voice was swallowed by thunder, his body soaked to the bone, and yet in that moment he felt a strange stillness within, a stillness that echoed the gaze of the golden deer. When dawn came, pale and cold, the forest lay shattered by the storm. Trees had fallen, rivers had swollen, and the paths they had known were gone. The men muttered that it was a curse, a punishment for their pursuit, but the prince said nothing. He knew it was not punishment, but revelation, a sign that their hunt had always been folly, that the deer was not prey to be claimed, but a truth to be understood. And yet they pressed on, for greed is not easily silenced, and pride is not easily surrendered. The trial was not yet over, and the greatest test still awaited them. Hidden deep within the heart of the forest, where the golden deer stood waiting, not as prey, not as conqueror, but as a teacher whose lesson would be written not in words but in the choices of men. The forest stretched endlessly before them, its depths darker and denser than any of the men had ever seen. A place where the air was so thick with silence it pressed upon their chests and made each breath a labor. The storm had passed, leaving behind broken trees and swollen rivers. But its echoes seemed to linger in the hearts of the hunters. They marched on, though their steps were slow and their faces hollow with exhaustion. For greed and pride still chained them to their path. The prince walked at the front, his shoulders heavy with more than the weight of his armor, his thoughts clouded by the visions that haunted him each night. He dreamed always of the golden deer standing in fields of endless light, its eyes steady and filled with compassion. Each time he awoke trembling, his heart torn between the ambition that had brought him here and the truth that pressed quietly against his soul. His men did not share his torment. They spoke only of treasure, of the fame that awaited them, of the coat that shimmered like sunlight and the fortune it would bring. They ignored the signs around them, the way the forest grew more silent with each passing day, the way the animals vanished from their paths, the way the trees themselves seemed to lean inward as though watching, warning, waiting. Their hunger made them blind, and their anger made them reckless. They set snares that caught only shadows, loosed arrows that struck only bark, and cursed each failure with louder voices. The prince listened to their rage, but he did not join it, for his heart no longer burned with the same fire. He remembered too vividly the eyes of the deer, eyes that had pierced him more deeply than any blade, eyes that seemed to see beyond his titles, beyond his pride, into the truth of who he was. And though he had not yet spoken it aloud, he knew that their pursuit was folly, that they were not hunting an animal but chasing a reflection of their own hearts. Still he pressed on, unable to stop, for the weight of expectation bound him, and the fear of appearing weak in the eyes of his men silenced the voice that whispered within. The golden deer moved always ahead of them, calm and unhurried, never far and yet never near. It walked through meadows where wildflowers opened to the sun, through valleys where rivers gleamed like silver, through groves where moonlight draped the earth in pale silk. Wherever it passed, peace lingered, a stillness that soothed the creatures of the forest, though sorrow deepened in its eyes. It knew the hunters followed, it knew their greed consumed them, and yet it did not hate them. It pitied them, for they were blind to the chains that bound them, blind to the suffering they carried with them like shadows. It did not flee, for to flee would be to accept fear, and fear was not a part of its nature. It walked instead with the serenity of one who carries a truth greater than life or death. One evening, as the sun sank low and the forest glowed with the fading fire of dusk, the prince and his men came upon the deer once more. It stood at the edge of a stream, its coat gleaming as though the water itself had risen to clothe it in light, its eyes meeting theirs across the distance. The men gasped, their greed surging, and they raised their bows with trembling hands. But again the prince raised his voice and stayed their arrows. He could not bear to see them strike, for something within him had begun to change, something that whispered of reverence rather than conquest. The men groaned in frustration, muttering curses beneath their breath, but the prince did not falter. He stepped forward, his hand empty of weapon, his eyes fixed upon the deer. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, the forest silent, the stream stilled, the air heavy with expectation. Then the deer lowered its head slightly, as though in acknowledgement, and turned once more into the trees. The men shouted in anger, but the prince stood unmoving, his heart pounding with something he could not yet name. That night the camp was filled with rage. The men confronted their prince, their voices sharp and accusing. They demanded action, demanded that he allow them to strike, demanded that he put aside hesitation and lead them to victory. The prince listened, his face calm though his heart churned within him. He spoke of patience, of destiny, of the need to wait and understand. But his words fell upon deaf ears. Their hunger was too strong, their pride too wounded, and they saw in his hesitation not wisdom but weakness. Some swore they would take matters into their own hands, swore they would strike the deer with or without his blessing. The prince felt the rift widen between them, felt the bond of loyalty break, and he knew that their path was nearing its end. That night, as the others slept, he walked alone into the forest. The moon was full, its light spilling across the earth, and the air was thick with the scent of blossoms. He walked without direction, his feet guided by something unseen, until, at last, he came upon a glade bathed in silver light. There, at its center, stood the golden deer. It looked at him calmly, its eyes reflecting the moon, its breath slow and steady. The prince fell to his knees, tears burning his eyes, for in that moment he understood what he had refused to see. The deer was no prize, no trophy, no creature to be captured. It was a mirror, a teacher, a bearer of truth. It had come not to be conquered, but to awaken. He bowed his head, his voice breaking as he whispered words he had never spoken before, words of humility, words of surrender. The deer did not move, did not speak, but in its gaze he felt an answer, a silence deeper than any sound, a truth that filled him like light. When he rose, his heart was changed, though he did not yet know how to guide his men. He returned to the camp at dawn, his face calm though his spirit burned with revelation. His men, however, had no patience for change. Their anger had hardened into violence, and their eyes burned with betrayal. They no longer saw him as their prince, they saw him as an obstacle, and in their whispers the shadow of rebellion grew. The prince knew that the trial was not yet ended, that the greatest test still lay ahead. A test not of strength but of compassion, not of conquest but of surrender. The golden deer moved on through the forest, ever patient, ever compassionate, waiting for the moment when truth would pierce the final veil of blindness, when the hunters would see not prey but the reflection of their own souls. And in that waiting, the forest held its breath, the trees whispering in the wind, the rivers murmuring in their flow, as though all creation watched and waited for the choice that would shape the fate of all who walked within it. The forest grew denser and darker as the days dragged on, its canopy shutting out most of the light, leaving only fragments of sun and moon to filter through the thick leaves above. The men who followed the prince had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed, their patience worn thin, their bodies weakened by hunger, and their minds twisted by the endless pursuit. They had entered the forest with laughter and bold words, but now they marched in silence, their boots dragging, their breaths ragged, their hearts hardened into sharp stones of resentment. The golden deer, still always just beyond reach, moved as serenely as it had from the beginning, its steps measured, its presence calm, its eyes filled with compassion even as sorrow deepened in their depths. The prince could not shake the gaze that haunted him, the eyes of the deer that seemed to pierce him whenever they appeared, showing him truths he wished to ignore yet could not escape. His dreams were now relentless, visions of standing in endless meadows filled with golden light, the deer before him, its voice unspoken yet filling his mind with lessons he could not deny. Each morning he awoke shaken, his pride crumbling bit by bit, his ambition unraveling like threads pulled from a cloth. Yet his men saw only his hesitation, and in their anger they mistook it for weakness. They whispered among themselves, their voices sharp with bitterness, speaking of betrayal, speaking of taking matters into their own hands, speaking of seizing the deer without him. The forest seemed to sense their growing darkness. The animals vanished from their path, the trees creaked in warning, and the wind carried strange whispers that unsettled even the most hardened among them. But greed had blinded them, and they pressed on, driven by hunger not of the body but of the heart, the insatiable hunger for what they believed was theirs to take. One evening, as the sky burned red with the light of the setting sun, the hunters stumbled into a vast meadow unlike any they had seen before. It stretched wide and open, the grass tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze. At its center stood the golden deer, its coat gleaming in the last light of day, its body radiant as though woven from the sun itself. The men cried out in triumph, their greed surging, and they raised their weapons eagerly, their voices rising in a roar. But the prince stepped forward, his hands empty, his voice firm as he ordered them to stop. He spoke not as a commander seeking obedience, but as a man who had seen a truth greater than ambition, a truth that burned within him like a flame. He told them that the deer was not to be taken, that it was no mere creature, but a bearer of wisdom, a mirror that revealed their own hearts. He told them that to strike at it would be to strike at their own souls, that to harm it would be to shatter the very balance of the world. His men, however, would not listen. Their eyes blazed with rage, their ears closed to his words, their hearts deaf to the quiet truth he spoke. They saw only weakness in his hesitation, only betrayal in his restraint. And in their fury they turned not upon the deer but upon him. Swords were drawn, voices shouted, and in the chaos the bond of loyalty shattered. The prince stood firm, his eyes calm though his heart ached, and he faced them not with violence but with sorrow. He raised no weapon, he struck no blow, but he spoke again of compassion, of the futility of greed, of the peace that awaited those who could lay down their pride. But his words were drowned by the roar of anger, and the men surged forward, their blades flashing in the dying light. It was then that the golden deer moved. With a grace that seemed beyond the realm of flesh, it stepped forward into the center of the meadow, its body glowing brighter as the last rays of sun slipped beneath the horizon. The light did not fade, but seemed to gather around it, as though the world itself poured its strength into the radiant creature. The men faltered, their steps slowing, their eyes caught by the brilliance before them. Their blades trembled in their hands, their voices fell silent. And for a moment the meadow was still, as though time itself had paused. The deer raised its head, its eyes sweeping over them, and in its gaze was no anger, no hatred, only a sorrow so deep it cut sharper than steel. It looked upon them as a parent might look upon lost children, as a teacher might look upon pupils who had strayed too far. And in that gaze their rage began to crumble. Some dropped their weapons, their hands shaking, their eyes filling with tears they could not understand. Others turned and fled, unable to bear the weight of what they saw reflected in those eyes. But some, bound too tightly by greed, still raised their bows, their voices shouting defiance as they loosed their arrows. The shafts flew swift and straight, but once again the forest itself rose to shield its guardian. A wind swept through the meadow, bending the arrows aside, scattering them harmlessly into the grass. The hunters cried out in despair, their rage collapsing into fear. For they knew then that they fought not against a beast of flesh, but against the very balance of the world. The prince fell to his knees, his face wet with tears, his heart breaking with both sorrow and release. He understood then what the deer had shown him all along, that life was not meant to be conquered, but to be lived with compassion. That true strength was not in seizing, but in surrendering, not in taking, but in giving. He bowed his head, his voice breaking as he whispered words of apology, not only to the deer, but to the forest, to his men, to himself. The golden deer stepped closer, its light surrounding him, and for a moment he felt as though he had been lifted from the weight of his own pride, his chains broken, his soul freed. The meadow glowed with peace, the forest breathed again, and the men who remained felt their anger dissolve, their greed melt away, their hearts softened by a truth they could not deny. Some wept openly, some sank to their knees, and others simply stood in silence, unable to speak. The golden deer turned then, its body fading into the light, and in an instant it was gone, leaving only the echo of its presence, the stillness of peace that lingered in the meadow, the memory of eyes that had seen them fully and loved them still. The prince remained kneeling long after the light had faded, his spirit humbled, his heart transformed. He knew then that their hunt had ended, not in triumph, but in awakening. That the true prize was not the deer itself, but the lesson it had carried, the truth it had revealed. His men gathered around him, silent, their weapons forgotten, their hearts changed in ways they could not yet understand. They turned at last from the meadow, their steps slow, their bodies weary, but their souls lighter than they had ever been. The forest welcomed them then, its silence lifted, its paths clear, its air filled with the soft song of birds. They walked out not as hunters, but as men who had been shown the depth of their own shadows and the light that could free them. The prince did not speak of conquest again. He spoke instead of compassion, of humility, of the need to live not for greed but for balance, not for glory but for truth. And though his men did not fully understand, they followed, for they had seen the golden deer, and in its gaze they had glimpsed something they would never forget. The return from the heart of the forest was unlike the journey that had carried the prince and his men into its depths. For though their bodies still ached with hunger and their clothes still clung to them with the dampness of rain and sweat, their hearts had been altered by what they had seen in the meadow where the golden deer had stood. The silence that once pressed down upon them now seemed gentle rather than suffocating, and the shadows that once filled them with unease now seemed filled with mystery rather than threat. The prince walked at the front, his steps slower than before, not from weariness but from humility, for he felt the weight of every moment as though the earth itself had been remade. He no longer thought of the deer as something to be taken, no longer dreamed of parading its coat before his people, no longer imagined his name sung as conqueror. Instead, he thought of its eyes, the eyes that had seen him fully and had looked upon him not with condemnation but with compassion. And he felt both shame and gratitude so deep they pierced him more sharply than any arrow ever could. His men followed in silence, some still shaken, some weeping quietly, some staring at their hands as though seeing them for the first time. They had entered the forest bound by greed, but they left it carrying seeds of awakening, though each would come to understand it in their own way. The forest itself seemed to recognize the change. Where before its paths twisted upon themselves and its rivers shifted course to confuse them, now the way was clear. The trees no longer loomed in judgment, but stood tall in quiet reverence, and the wind no longer carried whispers of warning, but the soft song of leaves. Birds returned to sing from the branches, deer grazed at the edges of clearings without fear, and even the wolves watched silently with eyes that no longer gleamed with suspicion, but with understanding. The prince felt it in his very breath, that the forest had forgiven them, that it had accepted their surrender, that it had seen the moment of transformation and allowed them passage once more. At night, when the stars spilled across the sky, the prince sat apart from his men, staring upward as though searching for the presence of the golden deer among the constellations. He remembered the dreams that had haunted him, dreams of endless fields filled with light, of the deer standing calm and radiant before him, speaking without words of truths he had been too blind to see. Now he no longer resisted those dreams. He welcomed them, letting the lessons sink deeper, letting the compassion wash away the last remnants of pride. His men too dreamed differently. Where once their sleep was filled with shadows and voices that mocked them, now they dreamed of peace, of rivers that never ran dry, of skies filled with gentle light. Some awoke with tears, others with laughter, but all awoke changed. They no longer argued, no longer cursed, no longer whispered rebellion. They carried the silence of the meadow within them, and it bound them together more tightly than any oath of loyalty ever had. Days turned into weeks as they made their way back to the edge of the forest, and in that time the prince thought often of the life he had lived before. He thought of the palace with its walls of stone, of the throne that had once seemed so secure, of the power and wealth that had once seemed the only purpose of life. He thought of the glory he had chased, the victories he had sought, the treasures he had claimed, and he saw them all now as shadows, empty and fleeting. What was wealth when compared to compassion? What was conquest when compared to peace? What was power when compared to the strength of humility? He knew then that his life would never be the same, that he could no longer rule as he once had, that he must carry the lesson of the deer into every choice he made. His men sensed the same, though few could put it into words. They looked to him not with the expectation of spoils or reward, but with the quiet trust of those who had walked through darkness and seen light. When at last they emerged from the forest, the sun shining bright upon open fields, they paused as though uncertain, for the world outside seemed changed by their own transformation. Villagers who had once feared them for their arrogance now looked upon them with curiosity, and the prince found himself speaking not of triumph but of reverence, telling them of the golden deer not as prey but as teacher. Some listened with awe, others with skepticism, but all felt the quiet strength in his voice, the sincerity that could not be feigned. Word spread quickly of the prince who had entered the forest seeking conquest, but had returned speaking of compassion. Some mocked him, calling him weak, saying he had failed. But others listened more deeply and began to wonder whether there was truth in his words. The prince did not defend himself against the mockery, nor did he bask in the reverence. He carried himself with humility, repeating only what he had learned, that greed leads to suffering, that compassion brings peace, that the chains of pride bind more tightly than any prison, and that true freedom comes not from taking but from giving. His men became living proof of his words, for they no longer boasted of the hunt, no longer dreamed of riches. They worked quietly alongside the villagers, offering help where they could, their eyes softened by what they had seen. Some even returned to the forest, not with weapons but with offerings of food left at its edge, a gesture of respect for the guardian who had spared them. The prince often returned as well, walking alone into the outer groves, standing in silence as though hoping for a glimpse of golden light between the trees. He never saw the deer again, but he felt its presence in the rustle of leaves, in the song of streams, in the peace that settled upon him when he stood beneath the canopy. He knew that the deer had not vanished but remained within the forest, watching, waiting, guiding in silence those who had the eyes to see. And he knew also that the true presence of the deer was not only in the forest but within himself, within every act of compassion, every moment of humility, every choice to let go of pride and embrace peace. Years passed, and the prince grew older, but the lesson of the deer never faded. He ruled with gentleness, guided by the truth he had learned, and his kingdom flourished not through conquest but through harmony. His people loved him not for his power but for his compassion, not for his victories but for his wisdom. He became known not as the prince who hunted the golden deer, but as the prince who had been changed by it, the ruler whose heart had been touched by something greater than himself. The men who had followed him into the forest each carried their own awakening. Some became teachers, speaking of the folly of greed. Some became healers, tending to the sick and the poor. Others lived quiet lives, but always with a gentleness that had not been there before. And though not all could put into words what they had learned, all carried within them the gaze of the golden deer, and it shaped the rest of their days. The story spread far and wide, carried by travelers and pilgrims, told by elders to children beneath the stars. Some dismissed it as legend, others revered it as sacred truth, but all who heard it felt a stirring within. A reminder that there is strength in compassion, freedom in humility, and light in surrender. And though the golden deer was never seen again, its presence remained, not as a creature of flesh, but as a lesson written upon the hearts of those who had encountered it, a truth that lived on through the choices they made. The prince often wondered in his quiet moments why he had been chosen, why the deer had revealed itself to him, why he had been given the chance to see beyond the shadows of his own pride. And though he never found an answer, he came to understand that it did not matter. What mattered was that he lived in accordance with what he had seen, that he carried the light into every corner of his life, that he allowed the compassion that had once looked upon him to flow through him to others. In this way the golden deer lived on, not in the forest alone, but in every act of kindness, in every heart that chose peace over greed, in every soul that awakened to the truth that life is not to be conquered but to be cherished. And so the story of the golden deer was not the end of a hunt, but the beginning of a journey that continued through generations, a journey that whispered still through forests and fields, a journey that lived wherever hearts were opened to compassion. The prince knew that he too would one day fade, as all men must, but he also knew that the lesson would endure, that the golden deer would never truly vanish, that its light would remain as long as there were those willing to see. The years continued their endless march, and the story of the golden deer became woven into the fabric of the land, carried on the lips of elders, whispered in the songs of travelers, and written in the quiet hearts of those who sought peace rather than conquest. The prince who had once entered the forest with ambition burning in his veins grew into a ruler remembered not for the wars he waged, but for the compassion with which he governed. His palace no longer echoed with the sounds of boasts and revelry, but with the voices of teachers, healers, and monks who came to share their wisdom. And the halls were filled not with trophies of conquest, but with offerings of gratitude from people whose lives had been touched by his gentleness. He never forgot the gaze of the golden deer, the eyes that had looked upon him without fear or anger, the eyes that had shown him a truth deeper than any victory could provide. Each decision he made as ruler, he weighed against that gaze, asking himself whether pride or compassion guided his choice, whether he was taking for himself or giving to others. His men too, though scattered by time, carried the lesson into their own lives. Some returned to their villages, transformed from hunters into guardians, teaching the young to respect the balance of the world, reminding them that greed brings only suffering. Others sought lives of solitude, retreating into the mountains to meditate upon what they had seen, their silence a testament to the depth of their awakening. Some traveled as far as their feet would carry them, telling strangers of the deer of light that had spared them, offering the story as a seed planted in every heart that listened. The forest remained untouched, a place of mystery and reverence, where those who dared to enter walked not as conquerors but as pilgrims. Many brought offerings of fruit, of flowers, of simple prayers whispered into the wind, leaving them at the edge of the trees with bowed heads. Some swore they felt a presence watching, a stillness that soothed their souls. Though the golden deer itself was never again seen by mortal eyes, yet its absence was not emptiness, for its presence lingered in the rustle of the leaves, in the song of the rivers, in the hush that fell upon the heart of anyone who entered with sincerity rather than greed. The prince aged with grace, his hair silver, his steps slower, but his eyes filled with a peace that no burden could break. He often sat at the edge of the forest in his final years, beneath the shade of ancient trees, his gaze lost in the shifting light, his breath slow and steady. He no longer longed to see the deer again, for he understood that it had never truly left him. It lived in the compassion he carried, in the humility that guided him, in the choices that had shaped his kingdom into a place of harmony. He had once sought to seize it, but in the end he realized that it had given itself to him not as a prize, but as a lesson. And in this realization he found peace deeper than any crown could bring. When at last his time came to an end, he passed not in fear, but in stillness. His final breath, a whisper of gratitude, carried on the wind. His people mourned him, not as a king who had ruled, but as a man who had lived with wisdom. A man who had shown them that true strength is not in conquest, but in compassion. They built no grand monuments, for none were needed. His legacy was the harmony he had nurtured, the peace he had sown, the lesson of the golden deer that continued to live within them. The story endured, carried through generations, retold around fires beneath the stars, written into the rhythms of daily life. Parents told it to their children not as a tale of a hunt, but as a reminder that greed blinds, that pride binds, and that compassion frees. Pilgrims carried it across mountains and rivers, and in distant lands it took new forms, new words, yet always carried the same heart. The golden deer became a symbol, not of wealth, but of awakening, not of conquest, but of surrender, not of possession, but of peace. It lived in the prayers of monks, in the songs of shepherds, in the whispered hopes of mothers for their children. And though centuries passed, though kingdoms rose and fell, though names were forgotten and histories rewritten, the story of the golden deer endured unbroken, as eternal as the forest that had once sheltered it. In the deepest sense, the deer had never been hunted, for it had never been prey. It had been a teacher from the first step, guiding those who pursued it into their own hearts, reflecting their shadows, revealing their chains, and offering them the chance to awaken. Some had failed, bound too tightly by greed, but others had seen, and in their seeing the lesson lived on. And so it is told even now, that in the heart of every forest there lingers a golden light, unseen by eyes clouded with desire, but visible to those who walk with humility. Some say that if one listens in the stillness of night, one can hear the soft steps of hooves upon the earth, feel the gentle presence of eyes filled with compassion. Some believe that the deer still walks among us, not in flesh but in spirit, guiding those who are lost, comforting those who suffer, awakening those who seek. Whether it is truth or legend matters little, for the lesson remains. The golden deer is not found by hunting, but by opening the heart. Not by seizing, but by surrendering. Not by chasing outward, but by turning inward. It lives wherever compassion lives. It shines wherever pride is set down. It awakens wherever one soul chooses peace over greed, and in this way the story never ends, for it is not the tale of a creature long vanished, but the reminder of a truth eternal. The forest still whispers it to the wind, the rivers still sing it in their flow, the stars still bear witness to it in their silent vigil. And those who walk gently, who listen deeply, who live with compassion, may yet feel the presence of the golden deer, a reminder that even in a world filled with shadows, there is always light to guide the way. In the quiet heart of the tale of the golden deer lies not the story of a hunt, but the unfolding of a truth, as timeless as the forest itself. What began as a pursuit driven by greed and pride transformed into a journey of awakening, where the prince and his men were confronted not by prey but by a mirror reflecting their own shadows. The deer, radiant and serene, never resisted with violence, never fled in fear, but met each moment with compassion so deep that it disarmed even the sharpest of weapons. In its gaze, the prince discovered the futility of ambition, the weight of pride, and the freedom that comes only through humility. His men, too, hardened by desire, found themselves undone by a stillness greater than their fury, their hearts softened by the silent lesson of compassion. The golden deer was never meant to be captured, for it was not a creature of conquest, but a teacher cloaked in light. A reminder that life is not about seizing, but about cherishing, not about taking, but about giving. The story reminds us that greed blinds us, pride binds us, but compassion frees us. It teaches that true strength lies not in the victories we win, but in the peace we nurture within ourselves and in the kindness we extend to others. Long after the prince and his men left the forest, the lesson endured, carried forward in their choices, their voices, and their lives. And it endures still, wherever hearts choose to let go of desire and embrace compassion. As you let this story settle within you, may its gentle truth be a lantern in the quiet spaces of your own heart. A reminder that even in the darkest forest, there is always light. If you wish to continue walking this path of timeless wisdom and soothing stories, I invite you to subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep, where each tale is a gentle companion guiding you toward rest, reflection, and peace.